It's so good to be with you today. Bringing greetings, as always, from our ministry and mission partners in Detroit and extending them onto you this morning. We're journeying as a church through Easter stories, resurrection stories. And today we come across one of my favorites. So this comes from the book of Luke, chapter 24. And we begin with the reading, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Let's listen to the word of God. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him, and he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all of this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us what they had indeed seen, a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now already over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. When I was 12, I could not wait for my birthday. I had heard rumblings that on my birthday, I would be getting my first ever remote control car. And so the day of my birthday, we had our birthday lunch. We gathered around the table in the living room to open presents, and I picked the one that looked like a mid-size car. And I opened it, and there it was. It was a remote control truck with big wheels, and I can still remember the little control tips. They were blue that I used to control the remote control car. And I was so excited. But I had to wait 4 hours for the battery to charge. So I plugged it in, waited 4 hours, took the car outside. It was a monster truck, so it could go over grass and all of those things. And I turned it on, and I started the remote, and it did not work. And I was crushed. I'd waited so long for this remote control car, plus 4 hours. I'd plugged it in. I did everything right. It was a brand new car, and it did not work. And even though I had received other good gifts, and even though my parents felt horrible and were already trying to figure out how they could return it and get a new remote control car, none of that mattered because I had hoped for this thing for so long, and it didn't work. If you can resonate with that just a little bit, then we can resonate with what the travelers in our text were feeling as we begin this story today. These travelers, they had hoped for so long for something. They had hoped desperately. And on this Easter day, they were feeling disappointment. They were feeling sadness. They were feeling as if they had been abandoned. This thing that they had hoped for so long had not happened. And so this verse from our text stands out and grabs me. This is verse 21, where Jesus comes alongside them. They do not recognize Jesus. And they say to him, "But we had hoped." This walk to Emmaus is on Easter. This is Resurrection Sunday. But from the sadness of these travelers, that word for sadness is the same as the word that we see earlier in the Gospels for a people that were confused and lost and hopeless, a sheep without a shepherd. It's that kind of sadness. And Jesus comes up and sees that on their faces because they didn't know that Jesus had risen. But even if they did know that Jesus had risen that morning, Jesus' plan, Jesus as Messiah, looked nothing like the resurrection that they had been hoping for. So they say in chapter 24, verse 21, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." We had hoped. See, they were looking for a conquering king. These are people who are very tired of being stepped on, of having their territory infringed upon, of not having all of what they wanted to eat available for them in the supermarkets. They were tired of the oppressive Roman Empire, and they were ready for a Messiah that looked like a powerful king. So even if they knew that Jesus had resurrected that Easter morning, they would not have known the full extent of what that meant. And we can't necessarily blame them. They were a people who were hurt and suffering. The disciples had hoped for a very different day, that Easter Sunday. They were looking out for a different kind of Messiah and all the hopes that they had for that Messiah. And those hopes themselves likely prevented them from seeing the real Jesus, who was standing right in front of them, walking alongside them. Those hopes may have prevented them from meeting Jesus in that moment. Friends, here's the hard reality. Jesus is not always the Messiah that we had hoped for. Jesus is not the Messiah that we had necessarily hoped for. One scholar points out that these two disciples, travelers on the road to Emmaus, they had all the information they needed to know their hope. They had all the information they needed to know that Jesus resurrected that morning. We can go through verse by verse, starting at verse 19. They identify this person, this Jesus, who they're talking about, as Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth is a miracle worker name. Jesus of Nazareth is a name used whenever Jesus does something especially powerful. So they knew that Jesus had the power to rise from the grave. And one incredible thing that stands out to me in verse 20 is that they had even started the process of confession and repentance, which is a necessary step along the road to salvation. In verse 20, we read, they say, before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. They say, our chief priests. Imagine how hard that is to say that we are identifying with the death, the murder of Jesus. And they're saying our chief priests, not just those chief priests off in the distance, but our. So they're starting to confess. And we've already heard in verse 21, they talk about the redemption of Israel. They were waiting for a redemption to happen. And then in verse 21 at the end, they also talk about Jesus rising on the third day. Or they're saying it is the third day. And they remember hearing Jesus' words about rising from the grave on the third day. They have all of these pieces. And then they have the biggest piece of all, which Pastor Kristen preached on last week and the week before, which is the women's testimony coming from the grave and telling them, we've been told that Jesus is risen, that he's no longer there. And yet here they are, sad on the road to Emmaus with all of these pieces. It seems like their hopes about who the Messiah would be caused them to overlook who the Messiah really was, to overlook what Jesus had done that morning. If you're like me, we join these two travelers on the road to Emmaus. You and I have often hoped for a different kind of Messiah. A Messiah with all the answers. A Messiah that restores a relationship with a family member. Graduates are maybe in the room today, or we're thinking of graduates we know and loved. You had 2.5 years that felt wrecked by this pandemic, of friendships you didn't have, of relationships you didn't start. We had hoped. There are parents in the room who are thinking of their last miscarriage and saying, we had hoped. There are people who are looking ahead to retirement and now run into the roadblock of health issues and saying, we had hoped. We had hoped for so many things that haven't happened, even on this side of resurrection. And so we joined the disciples on the road to Emmaus. 2 Sundays ago, the day before Easter, my uncle passed away at 63. And so I had the opportunity to go and be with my aunt and be with his son on Easter Sunday, sitting in the service in a church in Grand Rapids while people sang around us, just sitting, holding each other without a lot to say. And all I could think about was, we had so many hopes. I had so many hopes. He had so many hopes. Friends, the road to Emmaus, Easter Sunday in the Gospels, it reminds us that resurrection doesn't mean all is well, at least not immediately. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. Jesus is not always the Messiah that we had hoped for. But Jesus is the Messiah that we need. Resurrection does not mean that all is well, but resurrection does mean that all will be well. And here's why. Jesus is the Messiah who meets us on the road to Emmaus. In our doubts, in our fears, in our misplaced hopes, the Messiah meets us there. So we see that the Messiah meets us on this road first in honesty. I have to laugh at chapter 24, verse 25, which says, "Then Jesus, he said to them, 'Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared.'" This is after the two travelers had poured out their heart to Jesus, saying, "This is our hurt, this is what we're feeling." And Jesus responds by saying, "Oh, how foolish." No matter what way we slice this feels a little bit abrupt, at the least. I'm comforted by the translation of foolish, which doesn't mean dumb or stupid. It just means not knowing fully. It means not yet having the information. It's seeing through a glass dimly. It's recognizing that we don't understand the way the world works. And that is a small comfort. And Jesus being honest in that moment is a small comfort. But then Jesus on the road to Emmaus meets us as someone who has suffered. As someone who has suffered with and for us. And in his suffering, he worked salvation. So verse 26, Jesus goes on to say, "Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into glory?" Jesus had to unpack for these travelers the entire scope of the Old Testament. They were anticipating somebody like a king, somebody who would take charge and free them and liberate them today. And so Jesus had to take 7 miles to walk with them and say, the Messiah that you're looking for is a Messiah who suffers, who comes alongside. And as we were singing hymns with my family after my uncle passed away, I had to think that the hope of resurrection, that my uncle will live again someday, that is a hope, and that is a good hope. But it was a much firmer hope in that moment to think of Jesus standing with our family that day alongside somebody who's gone through suffering and through pain, somebody who was crying with us in that moment. That is a different kind of resurrection hope that we need. And then my favorite part, at the end of this verse, the Messiah gives us true hope when the Messiah meets us with a meal. This is verse 29. "But they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight." While this feeding, this bread, this sustenance is certainly connected to the sacrament, and it is what we remember, there are two very profound stories that this points back to and this points forward to. This breaking of the bread, resulting in understanding of salvation, goes back to the feeding of the 5,000, the story where Jesus in Luke breaks bread and scatters fishes and feeds the hungry people who were hopeless and helpless. And if you've wondered, at the end of this text, we see this appearance of Simon, who's not in this text before. The story isn't even in the Gospel of Luke, but Simon is mentioned. I wonder if Simon is mentioned because after Jesus feeds the 5,000, breaking the bread, that is the moment when Simon Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. And we have this declaration of Jesus as the Messiah when Jesus meets the physical and tangible needs of people who are hungry. And then this points ahead to another breaking of bread, which is in Acts 2, written by the same author of Luke. In Acts 2, after Simon Peter gives his sermon proclaiming salvation through Jesus Christ, after this, people go home and they break bread. And they break bread, and then they take all of their belongings and they share them as a community. They share them as a community. So this breaking bread of Revelation What it results in is something of a family meal, where Jesus says, not all of your problems are going to be solved today, but here's a family set by me. This is a table that I give you. Jesus sets the table for a family meal, where we are all welcomed, where the lame walk, the hungry are fed, and those who are mourning are comforted. This is the hope of a Messiah. Jesus is not the Messiah that we had so often hoped for. But Jesus is the Messiah that we need. Jesus meets us with honesty. Jesus meets us as a suffering servant. And Jesus meets us as a host of a family meal that points to resurrection. Rising from the grave was inevitable for Jesus. Rising from the grave happens in an instant. Rising from the grave doesn't even appear in Scripture in terms of the mechanics. But what does appear is Jesus rising and then returning and walking 7 miles on a dusty road to explain to us what salvation means. That is incredible. So, friends, as we remember this first breaking of the bread after the resurrection, we find true hope. And if the resurrection doesn't feel real to you today, then we're given this family meal as a way to tangibly demonstrate God's love and salvation. And I think that sometimes we make communion into something that feels almost magical, something that's 8 feet removed from everybody in the congregation. When I think of this meal today, I think of a particular cohort brunch with the young leaders that I lead in Detroit that we had several weeks ago. Leading up to this brunch, we had been having some challenging conversations between a few members of our cohort. Disagreements, some painful hurt, surrounding things like race, surrounding things like justice, surrounding things like personalities that just didn't get along. And one of our cohort participants, Basha, for our community meal, threw us this brunch. And it was not just any brunch. We had pancakes, we had sausages, we had bacon, but we also had sushi, and we had fried chicken. And it felt like after we gathered around that meal, we sat around this table, astounded by his generosity. The differences seemed to mend in a moment. We could share from our heart openly and honestly. That was not my game plan of how to bring our cohort back together. It was this incredible meal set before us where people started sharing their hurts and their pains and seeing each other and loving each other. And that is this salvation hope. That is what the disciples encountered on the road to Emmaus. And that's what we get to participate in today as we come before this table of the Lord.